Welcome to Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here is the podcast host, James Delingpole.
Hello, friend, and welcome to Delingpole, the podcast by me, James Delingpole, brought to you by Breitbart and Podcast One. And hey, by the way, Merry Christmas. Or is it Happy Christmas? I'm always being told off by my kids for getting it wrong. Apparently there's this new rule. It's, what is it? Oh yeah, Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Now, that's fine, except when I was growing up in the 1970s, we did not make that distinction. In England, I think until recently, it was perfectly acceptable to use the two phrases interchangeably, Merry Christmas or Happy Christmas. But then the Christmas Nazis appeared and insisted, no, there's a special rule. You see, it sounds more musical if you say Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. You're using two different words. And then, of course, there's the big problem you get in America. American listeners will be familiar with this. Most English people won't. You get this nonsense about happy holidays, which goes back really quite a long way. I was in DC recently, sitting in a hotel lobby waiting for my taxi to the airport, and it was they had this good arrangement where you get free bourbon. They had a whole trolley full of different bourbons, really quite high-end bourbon. So I was sitting there in the lobby getting slowly sloshed, and I needed to get sloshed because in the background American Christmas music was playing. And one of the songs went, Happy Holidays, Happy Holidays, Happy Holidays, Happy Holidays, Happy Holidays, Happy Holidays, Happy Holidays to you, something like that anyway. And it was really annoying. What struck me was that this song dated back, I would say probably, I'm guessing, but maybe to the 1960s. So Americans have been into this politically correct happy holidays thing so that they don't offend other religions for a very long time. On the way back to England at the airport, the woman at the British Airways desk said to me very confidently and unhesitatingly, Happy Christmas, she said, or maybe it was Merry Christmas. But anyway, the point was she was wishing me a happy Christmas in an uncompromising way, which didn't involve Kwanzaa or didn't involve holidays or anything else. It was Christmas. So, yeah, enough. Anyway, my special guest this week is a mate of mine called Christopher Snowdon, who is... glorious title, this. He invented it himself. He is the head of lifestyle economics at the Institute of Economic Affairs. So basically he deals with, I suppose, what I'd call health Nazis, people who try and campaign to make you smoke less, or people who try and ban e-cigarettes, people who are worried about, who come up with all these nonsense stories about sugar being like the new crack cocaine, and fat being bad for you. And he's a voice of moderation and statistical common sense in a sea of PC ghastliness. I don't know, if I'm honest, whether this interview is going to be any good or not. The reason is I recorded it after that lunch a few weeks ago I had with another of my guests, Kate Andrews. You remember her, the American girl I talked to a few days after the Trump victory? And Kate was great, but then afterwards we went out and had lunch with Christopher, and Christopher ordered up a glass of champagne each, and then we had a bottle of wine. I'm not a big lunchtime drinker, so we came back and I was not pissed exactly, but I was definitely merry, and I'm not sure that's the best condition in which to do an interview. Christopher, I think, can hold his drink much better than me, so Christopher will be interesting even if I wasn't. I think I probably gabble too much in this interview, so sorry about that, but I think there probably will be some interesting bits. Anyway, Merry Christmas to you all, and thank you. To you individual I meant, because I've forgotten people didn't like being addressed as you all. Thank you, lovely individual listener that I'm talking to now as if in a one-to-one conversation. I really appreciate the fact that you've been listening to my podcast. It means a lot to me. Apparently the podcast is going really well, and I'm looking forward to talking to you intimately again in the new year with lots of new exciting guests. I think there's one coming up with my brother Dick very soon, and that's very exciting too. Anyway, here we are, without further ado, an interview with Christopher Snowdon of the Institute of Economic Affairs, brought to you by Breitbart and Podcast One. Thank you and happy listening. My guest this week is a man you're going to totally love, even though he looks a little bit like a tramp who's wandered in off the street. His name is Chris Snowdon, and he's the head of... This is a title he invented for himself, I believe. He's the head of lifestyle economics at the Institute of Economic Affairs. And I think he's going to have some quite interesting views. Chris, welcome to the show.
Thank you, James, for that lovely introduction. I am actually wearing a suit, albeit without a tie.
You didn't shave for this podcast?
I didn't shave. No, I don't shave for radio.
No. or anything else, I
imagine. Not if I absolutely have to. Yeah.
Chris, I would imagine that say 10 years ago, if you'd met somebody like me, you'd probably think I was a complete wanker. You'd think, I'm just guessing. What are your politics, if you had to define them?
I would say free market liberal, or if you're an American, free market libertarian.
Did you ever go through a left-wing phase?
Oh, God, yeah. Didn't we all?
I didn't.
Did you?
Most people. I'm heartless.
Most more kind of balanced people went through.
That's what I was getting at, really.
Phase, I joined the Labour Party back in 96 or 97 when I was at university. Went to one meeting and never went again. I seem to remember they were boasting about letting down the tyres of the Vice-Chancellor at the university, and I thought, it's just not supposed to be a serious political organisation, so I never went again. And then my only other dabbling in conventional politics was, must have been around 2003, 2004, around about the time that they were talking about, what were they doing? Fox hunting and House of Lords reform and smoking ban, that kind of era, post-Iraq, I guess. I joined the Tory party and I went to one meeting with them where it was, It was St George's Day meeting. Very, very classically conservative. The average age in the room was about 69. And that was perfectly nice, but I never went to another one. And that was it for me. I joined the Libertarian Party briefly, but that was such a shitstorm that I didn't even go to a meeting.
Yeah, I don't see you as a natural Tory. But was there a sort of a moment, apart from being irritated by the kind of people involved, was there any particular political event that made you come out as a kind of a libertarian?
Not really, no. But it was a series of things, really. I guess when I was interested in left-wing politics, it was because I was interested in the idea of equality in the most respectable meaning of the word.
Like fairness, basically.
Fairness and equality before the law.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people over the last 50 years have been in favour of that. And it's when you realise that actually what the left is interested in is actually what they call positive discrimination.
Which is not equality.
Which is the opposite. It is discrimination.
Yeah.
That's when the scales started to fall from my eyes. And with New Labour in particular, I would still justify voting for Tony Blair in 1997. I don't think he did much wrong, actually, in the first 4 years. It was only later on things started to fall off. But the problem with New Labour eventually was that they got into this whole micromanaging of people's lives. In actual fact, 2001... students, I wasn't a student then, but students were sent this text message, you may remember, saying, don't give a 4x for closing time, vote Labour on whatever date it was in 2001. This was all about the Licensing Act and what came to be known as 24-hour drinking. That stuff was good. The Gambling Act, which was supposed to create Las Vegas-style casinos all over the place, that would have been good. Never happened, but it would have been good. And the declassification of cannabis from Class B to C was a good thing. Now, the latter of those two, the gambling and the cannabis, both got nixed by Gordon Brown. 24-hour drinking, I would maintain, is probably the best thing that government did. But there was actually a kind of libertarian feel to Tony Blair specifically, actually. I think it was him rather than the party driving a lot of this. But as the years went on, he got more and more ground down by his backbenchers, doing various things that I don't think his heart was really in. And for me, the big thing that turned it was a smoking ban, which I just still, to this day, I think is one of the most awful pieces of legislation.
It was illiberal, wasn't it?
Unbelievably illiberal.
That even in private clubs where people have paid their money and they can consent to a particular arrangement, they were denied that freedom.
Even if you want to set up a cigar bar and you're going to put on your door, this is for smokers only, and you're only going to employ smokers, or even if it's just you running the show and you haven't even got any employees, that's still illegal. Yeah. Because it's not about passive smoking, and the science behind passive smoking is mostly junk anyway. It was never about that. Obviously, it was about stopping people smoking. And you can see that now because they're talking about outdoor bans. Wales has just brought in an outdoor ban, or is about to bring in an outdoor ban in playgrounds. Okay, that's not a big deal. No one's particularly bothered about whether people smoke or not at playgrounds. But, of course, the idea is to set this precedent that we're going to start banning people smoking outdoors. Similarly, smoking in cars. At the moment, that's just if you've got somebody under the age of 18 in the car.
You can't smoke in a car. Yeah.
Already, Action on Smoking Health are saying, well, it'd be much easier, if we make this a blanket ban for people smoking in cars, because it's very hard for the police to tell sometimes whether somebody's 17 or 18, and it'd be much easier, wouldn't it? Much easier to have a level playing field. Just stop people smoking in their own cars when there's nobody else in it. So none of these bans got anything to do with passive smoking or secondhand smoke or the health of bystanders. It's about stopping people smoking. I think that was pretty obvious at the time, and that's one of the reasons the people who supported it. Okay. But for me, it was a blatant breach of the John Stuart Mill harm principle. It was clearly just this top-down approach of, we don't like this now. Non-smokers are a significant majority, and they're a big enough majority now to push this minority around.
So tell me about the John Stuart Mill harm principle.
Well, John Stuart Mill, On Liberty, 1859, set out this principle, which he was only really verbalising. I think it'd been part of English political life for a long time, which was that effectively you do not create a law unless it protects somebody from the harm of others, or you cannot be stopped doing something unless you are directly affecting negatively somebody else's personal property. He didn't invent that. It's basically the concept of liberty, but he verbalised it in the most eloquent way in that book. In the harm principle, which I've just outlined, is the kind of one-sentence summation of that.
So you and I would agree with that principle because we're quite hardcore, rigorous, classical liberals, stroke libertarians. But I think a lot of people out there might say, well, hang on a second. And among their number, oddly enough, is Jeremy Clarkson, who people think of as the kind of guy who sticks it to the authorities. I remember at the time of the smoking ban, Jeremy Clarkson said how pleased he was about all these liberal measures designed to stop people smoking even in private clubs, because it discouraged him from smoking. So he welcomed the intervention of a higher power to stop his bad habit. What would you say to the Jeremy Clarksons of this world?
Well, for a start, I'd say, are you still smoking? To which he would have to say, yes, I am.
Yeah.
As indeed the other handful of people I knew who made much the same argument at the time. It's this idea that, you're kind of Odysseus and you need to be strapped to the ship's mast to stop you doing something that you shouldn't do. People would take a pretty dim view of it if I gave up drinking because I had a drink problem and then demanded that alcohol not be served in
which
pubs.
You see a lot by that. You see this element, and a lot of reformed alcoholics are very much of that view, aren't they? I mean, I think Alistair Campbell, I think, is, for example, is often appearing on the radio, sort of railing against lax drinking laws.
Yeah, there are a few people like that. In the same way, ex-smokers are the worst ones. People who've never smoked tend not to be too bothered one way or the other, but ex-smokers have got this complex a lot of the time, probably because they're so angry, because they're craving a cigarette. Makes them want to take it out on other people. The woman who runs Action on Smoking and Health is an ex-smoker. She's a classic ex-smoker.
Well, Action on Smoking on Health, I've been very aware of its presence, but what is it exactly?
It's a state-funded pressure group, one of many state-funded pressure groups.
What? So the government pays ASH to lobby for action that it...
Effectively, yeah. There's a whole bunch of these organisations. I wrote about them in a number of IA publications, the first of which was called Sock Puppets. And what that paper does, and Action on Smoking and Health were one of the first organisations to alert me to this, it's you get these supposedly independent civil society groups, NGOs, charities, what have you, who actually, if you look at their financial accounts, they are very largely funded by the government.
By the taxpayer.
By the taxpayer, yeah. And that it's very prominent in the world of public health, because there isn't really much of a grassroots temperance movement, there isn't a grassroots anti-smoking movement, there isn't much of a grassroots anti-sugar or anti-gambling or anything like this movement. You get a handful of people who, I respect their opinions. If the Salvation Army want to stand up and say we think there should be more tax on alcohol, fair enough, But at least you know where you stand with the Salvation Army. You know that they're going to have a particular perspective on things like alcohol and gambling, and fair play to them. But with a lot of this so-called public health stuff, you have organisations which are funded by, and often even created by, the government, either at the domestic level or at the EU level, and they go on and on and on about these issues, and they create this apparent groundswell of support for example, plain packaging or minimum pricing or the sugar tax. But actually, when you dig a little bit deeper, these organisations are effectively just arms of a government department, usually the Department of Health, or they're arms of local councils. Local councils now are spewing quite a lot of money on these kind of activist groups, and I think it's an absolute outrage.
But what's the rationale? Is it simply that government likes to have more power and more legislation, therefore they create these sort of sock puppet organisations to justify, or is it something more subtle than that?
I think it's actually more subtle than that, because I think that if you spoke to people at the absolute top of government, they wouldn't know what's going on, because in the scheme of things, the NHS budget, the Department of Health budget, is well over £120 billion. They are not going to notice. Jeremy Hunt is not going to notice if 50 grand goes out to some activist group in Cumbria, right?
Yeah.
These things happen at a much lower level of bureaucracy. But it's somewhere along the line, you have people within the bureaucracy, within the Department of Health, who are essentially activists. You will see this, I'm sure, at the Department of Energy and Climate Change,
Yes.
or whatever it's called
Yeah.
now. You're bound to attract activists in government, right? I mean, a lot of these people couldn't get a job in the private sector anyway, so they're bound to be drawn to the public sector. And if you're an anti-smoking extremist, or if you're an environmental extremist, where are you going to look for a job, right? It's pretty obvious you're going to end up going to these departments, become a civil servant. And then you've got your hands on the purse strings, and what has tended to happen over the last 20 years is that you've had more and more money going to NGOs, third parties and charities in particular, and that these organisations become more political, and the government in effect is encouraging that. Not from the ministerial level, not at the prime ministerial level, but at a lower level of government there is this agreement that we need to have these people's voices out. It's very, very explicit at the EU level, where they've been doing this for donkey's years. They fund Friends of the Earth and groups like this, and the European Commission have been challenged on it. And they say, oh, well, we get lobbied by the oil companies a lot, and we need to have a balancing voice. What are you talking about?
Yeah.
I mean, there is a balancing voice. You can invite these guys in for a cup of tea if you want to hear from it. You don't need to pay them money so they can be out waving placards in the street. That's a bit different to listening to both sides of an argument.
Yeah, this is what Coleridge called the clerisy, isn't it? It's these kind of middle-class people, overeducated in worthless degrees, who need to find a job. They're not going to find it in the private sector, because really there's no need for somebody who's read environmental sciences at the University of East Anglia, for example. The only way they're going to get a job is in the state sector, lobbying for more of this activity.
Yeah, and I think, apart from anything else, it's incredibly wasteful. If the Department of Health want to do something, and quite clearly they wanted to do plain packaging, for example, right?
Yeah. Even though it doesn't work.
Well, it doesn't work, but I mean that's not the point. It's all to give somebody somewhere down the line something to do, and to have the appearance of movement and action. But the government clearly wants to do plain packaging, clearly wants to do various other public health things along the way. Clearly now wants to do a whole load of stuff on sugar, and there's a new alcohol report coming out from Public Health England shortly. And I mean, they're the biggest sock puppets of all, Public Health England. You've got these activists in this new quango sucking up hundreds of millions of pounds a year.
Quango, for American listeners, is a
quasi-autonomous non-governmental organisation.
Presumably there are equivalents to these organisations in the US as well.
Yeah, you get quite a lot of it in the US. but there are tougher laws in the US on charities lobbying per se, let alone lobbying with government money. So it doesn't happen quite so blatantly.
And what is this industry worth? Have you looked into that?
It's very hard to say. You can't really pin it down, to be honest, because there's organisations don't generally tell you how much they spend on campaigning and advocacy and lobbying. So you can only guess at how much of it is actually spent on those purposes. Bearing in mind, most of these organisations do somewhere along the line do a bit of good work.
Right.
So it's not, you generally don't get blatant lobbyist groups who are only there to bring about social change. You'll get groups like, for example, Oxfam, who clearly do spend at least some of their money doing some good somewhere.
Looking
you would
after
hope.
Starving poor
Right,
in
exactly.
Africa.
So you get an organisation that is helping, put up malaria nets somewhere, but at the same time they're also lobbying against free trade.
Yeah. That's so depressing, isn't it? Because we're often hearing, whenever you get a new government in, they're talking about how much they need to slash government spending, because there's always this pressure on them to slash spending. And yet there's probably this layer of bureaucracy which could be dispensed with tomorrow without harming anyone, really.
Yeah, but it doesn't seem to happen. I think for quite a lot of these groups, certainly the public health groups, the amount of money in the total pot of government spending is so trivial, it's hardly worth doing anything about it, even if ministers knew about it, which I don't think they do most of the time. Secondly, they are worried in government that they're going to upset these very vocal pressure groups. Right? These guys are very, very good at being vocal. That is their raison d'etre. They are there to make a noise. And so I think ministers are concerned that if you take away their money, they'll scream and shout about it. Actually, I think they're wrong. I think in Australia they did do this. They just said, no more funding for you, no more funding for you, no more funding for you. And they were gone. Literally within a week, they'd shut up. These people are not going to be doing anything unless you pay them, right? They're not volunteers. They're not really activists. They go from one job to another looking for a fat paycheck from the government. They're not going to actually kick up much of a stink, because as soon as you take away the money, you drain the swamp.
You're right. I've noticed this in my particular speciality, my reluctant speciality, which obviously is climate change and the whole environmental thing. And I know that what I've experienced is very similar to what you've experienced in your field. What always galls me is when I read a newspaper article about some new power plant, say some new fossil fuel plant, and fairly prominent in the article will be a quote from Friends of the Earth or Greenpeace or whatever, as if somehow you cannot write an article about energy without consulting the view of an environmentalist lobby group. Well, and I think, well, hang on a second, why? It's not like every time somebody runs a meat recipe in a newspaper, we have to have a countervailing voice from the Vegetarian Society, but that seems to be how it works.
Yeah, I'm in favour of having two voices in any article, but it's all about the weight you give those groups, and presumably these kind of articles, they don't also go to James Delingpole to see what he thinks about it, right?
Well, I'm just a right-wing climate-denying loon, so obviously you wouldn't consult me. You're listening to Chris Snowdon of the Lifestyle Economics Editor, title he invented at the IEA. More in a moment.
Do you like scary radio dramas? Tune into Fangoria's Dread Time Stories, fully dramatized horror stories hosted by Malcolm McDowell.
Irony is only one small ingredient of these Dread Time Stories.
Hear a new episode every other week on the Podcast One app, iTunes, and podcastone.com.
This is Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here once again is James Delingpole.
Hello, welcome back to the show with my special guest, Chris Snowdon, who's head of lifestyle economics at the IEA. Chris, we just had a rather agreeable lunch where we had a sort of enormous wiener-style sausage.
A lovely wiener.
It was a lovely wiener. And I asked you what you thought of the Trump election victory, and your immediate response was fantastic for the lols. I mean, we have 4 years of lols ahead of us, do we not? The misery of the left is just going to give us ecstasies for years to come.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not by any means a fan of Trump. I think he's a terrible candidate, and I think it's awful that the Americans had to pick between the two people they were given. So I wouldn't be very happy at all if I was in the USA at the moment, but we're not in the USA, and so we can just enjoy the banter as far as I'm concerned. And all these people moaning and crying in this country need to remember they don't live in America, right? It's really not going to have much of an effect on us. It might actually have a positive effect, quite possibly.
I'm much more positive than you, by the way. I think it's going to be really good, and I also think that Trump was a very necessary thing. I was genuinely getting scared in the run-up to this election. I was thinking the social justice warriors have become so dominant in our culture, even though they're a minority, that they seem to be dictating the terms of the debate all the time. And I was also worried about the fact that that democracy was bust, basically, because once you get, I mentioned this the other week talking to Kate Andrews, once you get a situation where over 50% of the economy is the public sector, you have a whole client class which are going to vote for whichever regime promises them more money. And I thought this is really the last chance to save democracy, and thank goodness, in a way, Trump, for all his faults, is a lot better than Hillary Clinton. I think you could agree on that.
Well, I don't know if I would.
You
Possibly.
bloody gay lefty.
I'm in favour of shaking things up.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm happy because it's going to be very funny for 4 years, and it doesn't really affect my life at all. But the guy is a transparent charlatan and a liar. And he's selling people.
So was Hillary, for goodness' sake. She was, she was a crook. Let's talk about what we can agree on, which I think is that this is a crushing. Would you not say that the left actually invited this defeat on themselves? The left created Donald Trump.
Yes, I think that's right to some extent. I think there's a complete incomprehension even now about why this happened. I was listening to the radio a lot the day after the election results, listening to 5 Live and BBC Radio 2, and they had all the people ringing in. There was some in tears. There was a guy who blamed the Daily Mail
just like Brexit.
Identical to Brexit. The only thing slightly different to the Brexit result was that they brought in an element of sexism to go with the racism. But it was basically racism, left behind by globalisation, racism. That was the BBC's answer to this, and a lot of people's on the left answer to this. And they don't seem to get it. They have so little self-awareness that by banging on about identity politics the whole time since the election, saying that, well, obviously women should have voted for Hillary Clinton because she's a woman, right?
Vaginas.
What other reason would a woman have to vote other than they got the same
because
genitalia?
Women are kind of stupid like that.
Yeah, and the black vote didn't come out as much as they did for Obama. But it was okay for blacks to only vote for Obama, not vote for Clinton.
That's
nothing
not
racist about that. That's just perfectly reasonable. That's what you've got to do, right? If you're black, you've got to vote for a black person. If you're a woman, you've got to vote for a woman. I look forward to what these people are going to say if Theresa May is the only female candidate in the 2020 general election, by the way. I suspect there won't be quite the same element of sisterhood being demanded.
Well, it was the same with Margaret Thatcher. I think the left decided, for the purposes of argument, that Margaret Thatcher was technically a man. Because that's the only way they can rationalise that one.
Yeah, people have explicitly said that. And I think they'll say the same thing about Theresa May. It's just pathetic, really. The left, I think, is just dead. It's doomed. It's been eaten up by its own identity politics. I mean, Nick Cohen pretty much predicted this in his great book What's Left a few years ago. The left has given up on economic progress, given up on improving people's livelihoods, and
workers' livelihoods.
Yeah. And the only reason to vote Labour was because you're an ordinary person and you want your income to go up, right? And the Labour Party could promise that for a long time. They might promise it by saying we're going to take from these people and give it to you. They might say we're going to give the unions more power, we're going to have a minimum wage, but at least there was some element of economic progress. Now, the likes of Corbyn, they've given up on economic progress. They don't like it. It's very bad for the environment. So all they've got now is identity politics. And identity politics is never going to win anybody an election, because actually people are individuals. Then I just can't believe that they're pushing on with this nonsense. How many times can you keep screaming racism every time you lose an election? They did it after the general election in 2015 in this country. They played it quite big with the London election, saying, oh, Zach Glossip, he's a racist. David Cameron, he's a racist. Nigel Farage, he's a racist. Donald Trump, oh, he's a fascist. So, where do they go from Donald Trump? If Donald Trump actually does a half-decent job as a president, what are they going to say about the next Republican?
Well, Mark Stein had a good line on this. He said, if everyone's Hitler, no one is Hitler.
It's right, yeah. It's right. You must give some succor to people who actually are racist. That apparently everyone's now a white supremacist.
I wonder whether what's happened to the left is analogous with what's happened to feminism, which is that I think we could probably agree that there was a time in history when women really did have something to fight for. They needed the fight for suffrage, obviously. They needed the vote. And in the same way that there was a time when black people were horribly discriminated against, and when the workers needed representation against capital. But I think that those times are pretty much gone. I mean, we've seen with third wave feminism, they are fighting against the reality, which is that actually all the statistics show that women are paid the same as men now. There is no real gender pay gap except the time that they take off to have babies, and that's fair enough. And is it not the same with economics, that really all the things that the old Labour Party fought for, that they're not there anymore, so they have to invent new problems to fight for.
They have to invent new victims. That's the thing. Yeah. There's a kind of built-in obsolescence in socialist politics, which is that it works and it's pretty appealing when you've got people who genuinely are dirt poor or are being discriminated against by the law. So you can fight for everyone to have a vote. You can fight for women to get the vote, and women to have equal pay by the hour as opposed to on average. But what happens is that people then actually do get better living standards, not actually because of socialism, actually because of free market capitalism, but the left can try and claim some of the credit for that. But then people get to a sufficient standard of living where they no longer want to be a socialist. They don't want to be in a trade union. They don't want to be told what to do by union bosses and the Labour Party. They want to live their own lives. And so the left is always going to be doomed once people reach some level of affluence. So then the left needs to create these new victims, these new victim categories. And they need to pretend that there's still endemic racism, still endemic sexism in society, even though individuals don't feel that and are going to continue just voting on the policies rather than on the identity.
Yeah, well, this is a conversation I quite often have on this podcast, because I've had quite a few people on who I think would traditionally have been seen me as the kind of the class enemy. People like Claire Fox, an ex-revolutionary Marxist, with whom I get on fantastically well, and ideologically we're two peas in a pod. I mean, I love you ex-leftists. I hope you don't mind me including
I was never quite a revolutionary communist.
Yeah,
I was a mild Blairite.
But yeah, a lot of the really soundest people that I encounter, the really good street fighters, were people who initially had lefty sympathies. And what I wanted to ask you was, do you think these terms left and right have any validity anymore anyway?
No, I don't. I don't think they have had for a very long time. And I think the whole Trump thing has brought that to the fore. I think there's a whole new grouping in politics. Because what you got with Trump is, you get rid of all this racism and sexism nonsense, right? The reason Trump came in, partly for what you're saying, because people are sick of the identity politics and people fretting about transgender toilets when there's still potholes in the road.
Are you saying that transgender toilets don't matter?
I could be saying that they are not the most important thing facing America at the moment. Yeah.
How actually, out of interest, how many transgender people are there? I mean, I saw a program in which Caitlin Bruce Jenner went on a road trip with it was great. Actually, it was really interesting. Do you know what? I'm a secret fan of Bruce Stroke Catlin.
I think Republican, isn't she?
I think he's rather cool.
She.
Sorry, whatever. But he was with all these other men dressed as girls, and one of them was really quite hot. Actually, I could get into this transgender thing.
The Ladyboys.
Where am I going with this one? But
Tell me about the Ladyboys.
I don't. No, there was. Watch the Bruce Jenner Ladyboy Tour show, or whatever it's called. It's even better than Dance Moms. Yeah, they had a really hot man woman on it. But what I'm saying is, they're kind of rare as hen's teeth. These people,
yeah,
aren't
of course
they?
they are. Yeah, and it has no effect on anyone's life, really. I shouldn't think even having different toilets has a great deal of effect on anyone's life. Presumably, if you really look like a woman, it doesn't matter what toilet.
Well, exactly.
You
So
use a woman's toilet, right?
if you pass, then what's the problem?
Yeah, if you look like a bloke, then go in there. Blokes, if you don't, then what's the problem here? I don't really understand it.
No.
But I suspect most Americans would agree with us that it is not a particularly important topic. But what you got with Trump, yeah, some people kind of voting against the whole PC thing and all that. That's great. But actually, a lot of people were voting for the thing that he made actually absolutely central to his platform, which is essentially anti-globalization. I saw Naomi Klein shortly after the election result saying that the victory of Trump means we need to fight even harder against neoliberalism. The victory of Trump is the biggest blow against neoliberalism for the last 30 years. This guy wants to tear up free trade treaties, he wants to stop trading with China, he wants to bring in all kinds of tariffs and subsidies and God knows what else. This is exactly what Naomi Klein has been looking for years. Now, it might have a racial tinge to it, but that's really the only thing separating Trump's politics from hers.
Yeah. We'll talk about a bit more about Naomi Klein and the reason for the Trump victory in the final stage of this thrilling podcast.
Hey everybody, I'm Heather Dubrow.
And I'm Dr. Terry Dubrow.
Every Friday, check out my podcast, Heather Dubrow's World.
We also have a brand new show, The Dr. and Mrs. Guinea Pig Show, every Tuesday.
So don't forget, iTunes and Podcast One. Tune in to Dr. and Mrs. Guinea Pig on Tuesdays and Heather Dubrow's World every Friday.
This is Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here once again is James Delingpole.
So welcome back to my special guest, Chris Snowdon, the head of lifestyle economics at the Institute of Economic Affairs. I want to float an interesting theory past you, which I came up with the other day with the help of my good friend Christopher Booker, which is that actually one of the main reasons, perhaps the reason that Trump won the election was because of green politics, and there has been a very unhealthy alliance, I think, between the left and the green movement. In fact, I think they're pretty much one and the same. I call them watermelons, green on the outside, red on the inside. And a good example of this is Trump's victory in the American coal states, which are traditional Democrat voters. Now, the Obama administration fought this war on fossil fuels. They were advocating clean energy, and clean energy definitely ain't coal. So you've got all these workers in these traditional industries in places like Pennsylvania, who suddenly find themselves being shat on by the people who formerly used to represent their interests. So and you remember that Obama sought to define the success of his presidency on its success in the war on climate change. Well, good luck with that one. Isn't it odd that Naomi Klein, who thinks of herself as a greenie, is opposing the person who actually is going to, you mentioned before, fighting against the kind of neoliberalism that she was so much against herself.
She thinks of herself as a greenie now because it's a last resort. Yeah. She never mentioned in her first two appalling books. And by the way, The Shock Doctrine is the most dishonest book I think I've ever read in my life, and I've read a lot of it.
What do you mean? Just badly references?
Totally rewriting history. I mean, like black is white kind of rewrite of history. Unbelievable.
Well, you get that with Owen Jones as well. Bless him.
No.
You do. His facts are so kind of dubious.
No, but Owen Jones wouldn't, for example, portray a lifelong pacifist like Milton Friedman as being a warmonger, which is central to Naomi Klein's argument.
Oh, okay.
This is the kind of mad stuff we're talking about. And she basically seems to think that somehow Margaret Thatcher started the war of Argentina to get herself back in power in 1983. It's a crazy book, but that's by the by. The point is, she never really said anything about environmentalism in those early books. She resorted to it with her book This Changes Everything. The title itself tells you that she hit a brick wall and needed to find some other way of justifying her argument for very big global government, and she's got it in the environmental movement. It's a pretty horrible combination, really, the eco-mentalists and the left. Because what it has done, and it goes back to what we're saying about the left being dead, it's dead largely because of these people. Because the environmentalists got in with the labour movement in the 1980s, when the labour movement was down in its luck, and persuaded the bourgeois left that economic progress is a bad thing because it's bad for the environment. And it was at that point that the left stopped having a positive message for people about improving their standard of living, because the belief now amongst a large section of these people in the Labour Party, and Naomi Klein, the Democrats and people like that, is that actually that we can't afford as a planet to have any more economic progress.
Yeah,
that of course does not appeal to people in the north of England who are scraping for a living.
You're right. The intellectuals have hijacked the left-wing intellectuals have hijacked a movement, and they no longer represent the people that they're supposed to be representing. Because obviously, if you believe, as the Greens certainly do, that economic growth is in and of itself a bad thing, then you have a situation where yes, there is a pizza pie which is not growing, and therefore you do have to fight to allocate chunks of that pizza pie to special interest groups. You haven't got a situation where a rising tide floats all boats, which is scary.
Yeah, but it's entirely consistent with the very reactionary way that the Greens look at the world. And then you get Corbyn, who kind of has one foot in each camp, right? So in a lot of ways, he's a very traditional old left-wing Labour union type fella. But on the other hand, he's a tree-hugging vegan and all this. So he will go around, he'd probably been on marches this year commemorating the miners' strike, very upset about what Thatcher did to the mines. Would he reopen the mines, do you suppose? No. If he'd have been in charge, they would have been closed down a few years later anyway because of carbon dioxide.
Coal is bad in the UK, yeah, exactly, yeah. God, I wish I'd bought shares in Peabody a few months ago. You know that coal has been the biggest performing commodity of anything, including gold, silver, copper.
It went up a lot 24 hours after the Donald got.
Well, it had already gone up 100% this year before the rise. And of course the Chinese are going for coal big time. The Germans are going for coal big time. I mean, Germany is about as green as you can get, and Germany is burning lignite, which is dirty coal, because they've had to replace their nuclear power industry because of the green movement.
Yeah. Well, what we really need to do is get fracking. That's a huge goldmine that Britain is sitting on. And I'm glad that Theresa May, despite some of this rather dodgy left-wing banter she's been coming out with recently, everything she's actually done, like approving a third runway, approving fracking, gutting the childhood obesity strategy, incidentally, has been actually pretty positive.
Oh, tell me about the childhood obesity strategy. That sounds
well, according to Channel 4 dispatches, it was originally 37 pages long, and when it was published, it was 13 pages long. And basically, Theresa May, it seems, got rid of all the really mad nanny state stuff, and the public health people are very unhappy about this, but it's a very good job. There was going to be all sorts of stupid and ineffective restrictions on marketing and what you can buy in shops and where shops can place things and what shops can discount and all this kind of stuff. We still got, though, a very bad situation. The fact that so much of it was left out has given these people a reason to moan and complain, but that has taken people's eye off the ball of what's actually going on with this childhood obesity strategy. Not only have we got this sugar tax set at a rate of 20%, which is higher than any other country's experience.
That exists now?
It'll come in April 2018.
Do you know, I didn't even know about this.
Really? Yeah, no, all fizzy drinks, all sugary drinks will be taxed.
And who was responsible for that?
Well, Cameron originally. I mean, it was George Osborne.
Kelsey.
Yeah, it was George Osborne trying to cover up for a very bad budget in March or whenever it was. So he sprung this rabbit from his hat to distract the media from a whole series of very bad bits of economic news. But he pulled the sugar tax out, and everybody looked at the sugar tax instead. So unless they change their mind about this, and you never know, could happen, they're going to bring in this ridiculous tax.
And who's that going to hit? The sugar
well, it
tax?
hit the poor most, like all indirect taxes do. But you know, even people like Jamie Oliver, who campaigned very hard for this, he actually even said he was going to go ninja if the government didn't bring it in.
What does that mean?
I don't know. I think it's just a
wear a headband,
meaningless slogan.
Things.
You know what he's like. He spent 2 years of his life campaigning for the sugar tax, and within days of it coming in, he said it's not really going to make any difference. It's just symbolic.
Oh, thanks, Jamie.
Well, can we get rid of it then? You know, because it's going to cost low-income households a reasonable, not a huge amount of money. It's going to take a few tenors out of their pocket every year, whereas multi-millionaire Jamie Oliver will be unaffected by it. But it is symbolic, and that's the point. That's why we should be concerned about it. Not because it's going to put the price of a can of Coke up by 8p, but because this is now setting food and soft drinks down the tobacco road. That's the issue.
Okay.
And all the stuff that was ripped out of the childhood obesity was going to take us further down that road. It was going to be advertising bans and all the stuff we've seen with tobacco. Everything with alcohol, with food, with soft drinks is on that same blueprint. These public health people have looked at what we've done with tobacco. We've made smokers basically second-class citizens. We've demonised the industry. We've abolished all advertising, whacked the price up beyond belief. They now want to do that with everything else that might have some risk to health.
But again, playing the devil's advocate, which I find very hard to do on this issue, but I'm going to try. Sugar, we now know, is like really bad for you. Do we not think that the government ought to be doing something from stopping children getting fat and their teeth rotting and et cetera, et cetera? Why shouldn't the government intervene in this benign way?
Because, for a start off, it's really got nothing to do with sugar. The hysteria about sugar has been a brilliantly orchestrated campaign by a very small group of people to portray sugar as literally the new tobacco. That's one of their slogans, sugar is the new tobacco.
Is it not?
And pick on... Of course it's not. Of course it's not. But
you can't smoke sugar, can you?
No, not really. I guess you can snort it, but you can't smoke it. These are literally the same people who were going after fat and salt a few years earlier. You know, eventually, when the world was ready for a new tobacco, once we'd done pretty much everything we could do with smokers, the world was ready to hit something else. Could have been alcohol, could have been fatty foods, ended up being sugary drinks. All made by big, horrible American corporations, probably make a lot of profit, lots of advertising goes on.
Oh, no.
Coca-Cola pretty much is the symbol of capitalism, really. Let's go after these guys. Contribute 3% of the entire calorie intake of the nation. It's a trivial amount of calories, let alone sugar. But they're going to go after him because they can, and they're going to do the same tedious, boring, annoying, regressive stuff as they did with tobacco. And it's just going to go on and on and on unless somebody puts a stop to it.
Did you invent the word bansterbaters?
No, that wasn't me.
It's a good word, though, isn't it? But it does describe the phenomenon. Would you say that just as Gilbert and Sullivan say that every girl and boy born alive is either a little liberal or else a little conservative, that there is within the human race this division between those who want to be just left alone to do what the hell they like and those who cannot help interfering and ordering people about?
Yeah, there really is. I don't know why that is. But it does seem to be the case, and it does seem as if it's nearly 50-50, like so many things. Like how many elections finish nearly 50-50? It's incredible, isn't it? Right?
It's weird. I'm sure that in maybe 100, 200 years' time, people are going to work out the neuroscience that there is a kind of bansterbater type, and there is a kind of freedom-loving loon type like you and me, and it's always going to come out in the end. It's always going to manifest itself.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And even people who will. I mean, you started off talking about John Stuart Mill, and the thing about that John Stuart Mill harm principle is that it's really quite uncontroversial. Nobody really has ever convincingly said that this is wrong. Even people like Mussolini would pay lip service to the concept of freedom, and so the people who were born believing that actually they know best and other people should do as they're told, they always have to work around it. And so people spend a lot of time kind of undermining that or making ad hoc exceptions to it. So it's like, look, I don't mind if you want to drink yourself to death. Of course, that's entirely up to you. But...
It's that but, isn't
and
it?
it's usually followed by, why should I have to pay for it? That's the most popular one. Because that gets a bit of traction with people, because then it seems like an economic argument. And yeah, there is a harm principle bit to this, because I'm having to pay for all these drinkers.
Right.
Of course, that doesn't stack up, because drinkers pay £14 billion a year in alcohol duty. Far exceeding.
And the same with presumably smoking taxes as well.
Even more so with smoking, yeah.
Isn't that... I've seen this a lot, the way that the liberal left is always trying to find an economic or a scientific justification for their masturbation instincts, because it's not enough that they, as you say, they rightly recognise that there is this John Stuart Mill argument, which they're going to have trouble getting around. But if they can invoke the higher authority of science or economics,
of just external harm. Actually, I mean, they generally work within the harm principle. People might not have read John Stuart Mill, but most people have this general idea that, to put it colloquially, your right to swing your fist ends at my nose, right?
Right.
You can do what you want, just don't hurt me. That is implicit in liberal democracies, okay? Yeah. And very few people are prepared to directly undermine that and say, actually, no, even if you're not hurting other people, I don't think this is for your own good, therefore I'm going to stop it. And so you'll get people doing things that are blatantly paternalistic, but will bring in negative externalities. So the smoking ban's a classic example. It was obviously a paternalistic measure to discourage people from smoking, clearly. Yeah. And since it's come in, the public health people have said, oh, this number of people gave up smoking, isn't that wonderful? Okay, right. It was about getting people to give up smoking. It wasn't about protecting bar staff from some tiny risk.
But they lied about it. They cited the... I love the story about Enstrom and Cabot, the biggest ever survey of passive smoking. And these two correct me if I'm wrong here, these two researchers were originally recruited by the American Cancer Society, by various health lobby groups to demonstrate that passive smoking gave you lung cancer and had all sorts of effects. And halfway through this massive research, they began to realise that no, passive smoking doesn't do any
there was no
measurable harm. And suddenly they were dropped like a hot potato by all the health
That's
lobby.
more or less what happened. And in the years leading up to the smoking ban in Britain, the evidence on passive smoking was actually getting weaker, not stronger. The evidence on passive smoking started with a bang in the late 70s when a Japanese epidemiologist found quite a strong association between being married to a smoker and lung cancer. But they then looked at it for 20 odd years, and to anyone who looks at the evidence objectively, there was just no association. It was just a hodgepodge of epidemiological associations pretty much sticking to zero, slightly to one side or the other, but basically around about zero. But it doesn't matter. There's no point in us talking about it. This debate is finished, right? The mere fact that we have a smoking ban is enough proof in most people's mind that passive smoking is a mortal threat.
Just briefly,
but it is all based on paternalism, really.
Why is the World Health Organization trying to ban e-cigarettes?
Yeah, well, this must be a reference to the recent conference they had in Delhi. I mean, the World Health Organization is just, I said in The Spectator recently, it makes FIFA look like a bunch of Girl Guides. I mean, it's just unbelievably corrupt and shady and secretive. So they have the first international treaty on public health, which of course involves tobacco. They're now looking at having an international treaty on alcohol and fizzy drinks too, don't worry about that. But it started, as everything does start, with tobacco. So they have a framework convention on tobacco control. Most countries have signed it, and it sort of commits you, but not really, because it's not actually law, but it sort of commits you to advertising bans and smoking bans and that kind of thing. And every 2 years they have a big shindig in some country or other where they get a few delegates along and they discuss how to amend this treaty. In practice, how to make it more draconian. And the UK delegation, interestingly enough, is Deborah Arnott from Action on Smoking and Health, which is putatively a private charity. Apparently she represents the country when it comes to this, and a couple of bureaucrats from the Department of Health who effectively give her grant every year. And they go along and rub shoulders with people from quite a lot of corrupt regimes. North Korea gets a good shout most years. WHO gave an award to North Korea.
What for?
In September, services to public health.
What? Because everyone's so thin there.
Well, I'm not even kidding, James. But in 2010, when Margaret Chan, who's the WHO Director General, she went there, she complimented North Korea on the lack of obesity. I'm not kidding you.
I wonder why that lack of obesity could be.
It's just good public health work.
Good public health. Well,
they've probably got a sugar tax, I expect.
Oh, I bet they do. Yeah.
And it's the advertising restrictions. So you can't advertise Coca-Cola in North Korea and look at the results. I mean, they speak for themselves.
It's marvellous. We should follow that paradigm. But you said that the World Health Organization is corrupt. But whence does this corruption spring? Why does it need to be corrupt?
Well, it's full of fanatics. A bit like the Department of Health and Department of Energy are going to attract people who are true believers in various causes. The WHO attracts public health nutters from all around the world. The UK, I'm ashamed to say, is very overrepresented on this score. So they get various fanatics from different NGOs and universities to produce reports saying that food advertising makes kids obese and this kind of thing. But they also have to rely on donations from big philanthropists and big businesses, which there's nothing wrong with that per se. But the problem is that these wealthy philanthropists generally come from rich countries. So they're people like Mike Bloomberg, who you may remember as being the nanny-in-chief in New York for years and years and years, who banned smoking in Central Park, for example. Tried to ban the sale of fizzy drinks in more than half-litre sizes, kind of thing, right? So he's a multi-billionaire. He gives WHO money, but all these donations get earmarked for things. So Bloomberg will say, we're going to give you all this money, but you have to use it for stopping smoking or campaigning against fizzy drinks.
Bloody business, aren't we?
So yeah, well, you should be campaigning for the soda tax in Mexico. But Bloomberg gave the campaigners in Mexico a fortune to campaign for a fizzy drink tax in a country where a lot of people don't even have access to clean drinking water. But these are rich men's concerns, right? Now the WHO, it does of course get funding from government as well, but it's relatively underfunded for a large UN agency. But the reason that governments give the WHO money is to try and wipe out infectious diseases in the third world, right? Where kids are dying all the time from all kinds of horrendous conditions. Unfortunately, because of this bias in funding from rich philanthropists and also, it has to be said, big pharmaceutical companies who have their own interest in the nicotine world, the WHO has been very much biased towards worrying about these developed world concerns of what they call non-communicable diseases, which is basically anything that kills you which isn't a communicable disease. Right. In other words, the kind of things we should be dying of and that we want to be dying of: cancer and heart disease and old age.
Well, speak for yourself.
If you want to die of malaria...
I don't want to die at all, sorry.
Okay, well, if you're going to die, I would recommend a non-communicable disease every single time, not dysentery or malaria. Yeah. So there's this bias towards rich people's concerns, and so they are spending way too much time campaigning against smoking, drinking, fizzy drinks when they really should be putting their limited resources towards disease eradication, which they could probably do if they spent half as much money in the third world as they do pestering people in the rich world. But to answer your original question, why are they so against e-cigarettes? It's a combination of two things. One is that you get these anti-nicotine, not just anti-smoking fanatics who've got a real bee in their bonnet about e-cigarettes for whatever reason. Some of them may genuinely believe that it renormalises smoking. It's a gateway to smoking for kids. All the evidence shows that it isn't. And then I'm not a big one for kind of ad hominem, follow the money type arguments, but I think the fact that all the makers of Nicorette gums and nicotine patches and what have you are funding WHO tobacco control initiatives, I think has probably had at least a subconscious effect on some of the people at the WHO in clamping down on a much safer nicotine delivery system.
I thought that the tobacco companies had invested quite heavily in e-cigarettes.
They have now, yeah. I mean, it's taken them a while, and still the vast majority of e-cigarette companies are completely independent. But yeah, I mean, the tobacco industry quite sensibly is picking up on the trend. I mean, the e-cigarette market is one of the fastest growing markets.
Well, you and I, in the course of this interview, we've been puffing away on your. What have you got there?
I've got something from an independent company. It's called Cool Fire 4 Plus.
And what brand of tobacco juice have you been smoking there? What flavour is it?
This one, James, is called Number 7, and I'm on my last few bottles because the EU has brought in all these stupid regulations for no reason whatsoever, and so the quality of e-cigarette liquids and devices is now, if not plummeting, then certainly plateauing.
Well, Chris, as always, I could go on forever talking to you because you're a man of great wisdom, and You're a street fighter as well. But before we go, I'd just like you to remind me your description of one of our mutual arch enemies, Simon Chapman, Professor of Public Health at some Australian university.
Yes, great sociologist, Simon Chapman.
How did you describe him?
Well, Private Eye, every time they mention me, which has been a bit more than I would like this year, always point out that I call him a scrotum-faced headbanger. But I stand by this.
A scrotum-faced headbanger,
Yeah,
yes.
he's a scrotum-faced headbanger. I've called him other things as well, but that's the one that comes up via Wikipedia. So, yeah, it's true. You should probably explain who he is.
Well, I encountered him. One of the most vicious enemies I've ever encountered is Big Wind. The wind farm industry is I think, a massive boondoggle, a terrible insult to the taxpayer, and not to mention the environment. And one of my most vociferous opponents when I campaigned in Australia against the wind industry, which is just ruining country people's lives and their health, by the way. He was one of my most vigorous opponents, and I just wonder what his qualifications for this. I mean, he started talking about something called the nocebo effect, and sort of defending wind turbines with this pseudoscience, which it seems to be a characteristic of the masturbation movement.
Well, he's we're in danger of giving him a bit more airtime than he really deserves for an obscure Australian sociologist. But he is particularly loathsome because he actively insults and denigrates people who he should be, with his public health hat on, helping. Now, I don't know much about the science of wind farmers, but even if you believe that all the people who complain about various conditions as a result of wind farms, even if you believe that's all psychological, then they are still psychologically distressed, right? Yeah. And you shouldn't be poking fun at them. Similarly, he pokes fun at vapors, and mocks them as addicts and all this kind of stuff. Now, this is somebody who is, as I say, supposed to be vaguely within the parameters of medicine. In reality, of course, he's a left-wing sociological activist who has decided he's going to stand up for big wind and oppose what he sees as big vaping and big tobacco. He's just a nasty piece of work. But Australia's kind of
they're a
write-off, really, when it comes to this.
Australia is over, isn't it? I mean, it's so sad. One thinks of Australians as being out of the Forex advert and no-nonsense people, but actually, I've rarely encountered liberals in the unpleasant sense of the word. Left liberals.
No, they've been
worse than the ones in Australia.
They've been taken over by the liberal left.
So bye Australia. I think we're going to end there because it's gone for so long. But I've been lovely talking to you, Chris Snowdon, lifestyle economics editor, head of lifestyle economics at the IEA. Thank you, Chris. Bye.